So, this HOA president literally barged into my cabin, right in the middle of me having a beer with the state's attorney general. She managed to break 6 laws right in front of the one person in America who could send her straight to jail. I'm talking full-on, splintering wood, designer heels clicking on shattered glass, the whole shebang. This woman, in her $1,000 blazer and that overpowering perfume probably worth more than my truck payment, storms into my grandfather's cabin, ranting about violations and jurisdiction like she owns the place. No clue who she was interrupting. No idea she was live streaming her own arrest to 3,000 followers, just 6 months before. I thought she was your typical power-hungry neighbor. Turns out, she was running a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. And I was about to unwittingly destroy her criminal empire. What would you do if some HOA lunatic invaded your private property during the most important meeting of your life? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'm willing to bet many of you have dealt with these neighborhood tyrants before. Let me rewind and explain how this nightmare began. 6 months ago, life was looking pretty great. I'm Marcus Henley, 52 years old, and after 30 years working in muddy trenches installing power grids across 3 counties, I had finally earned my retirement. The highlight of it all was my grandfather's fishing cabin on Clearwater Lake, 2 acres of pure paradise that old Pop bought in 1963 for only $800. Can you believe it? $800 for a lakefront property that's now worth more than most houses. This wasn't a fancy McMansion either. We're talking hand-hewn logs, a stone fireplace built by Pop with his own calloused hands, and a screened porch that creaked in all the right places. I kept it completely off the grid on purpose, solar panels humming on the roof, well water that tasted like childhood memories, and a septic system that worked better than most city setups. Each morning, the mist rising off the lake reminded me why Pop had chosen this spot. He used to say, "The land picks you, not the other way around." Smart man. He also said, "Marcus, when someone really wants your land, find out why, because it's probably worth more than they're letting on." Then Delilah Cromwell showed up. Everyone called her the whole psycho. She arrived like a tornado in designer clothing, 58 years old and fresh from some California subdivision where apparently being a neighborhood tyrant was a full-time job. She drove a pearl white Escalade with vanity plates that read Rule 1, and wore her HOA president badge on her blazer like it was a sheriff's star. Her mission? Transform our rustic lake community into what she called an upscale resort. But here's what I didn't know at the time: 3 elderly couples had already sold their cabins to buyers within 2 months of her arrival. Coincidence? I think not. Her first act of work came on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting on Pop's porch, drinking coffee and watching loons teach their babies to dive when I heard sharp clicks on the wooden dock designer heels at 7 a.m. on my private property. 10 minutes later, she was taping an official-looking notice to my screen door. Violation citation. Unsightly dock structure damaging community property values. Fine, $500. Compliance required within 72 hours or daily penalties will accrue. I had to read it twice. My weathered dock, the one Pop and I had reinforced together when I was 12, was apparently an eyesore threatening the entire neighborhood's real estate market. Being a reasonable guy, I walked over to explain that my property actually predated the HOA by about 40 years. You know what she said while standing in my driveway, hands on her hips like she owned the place. "Everyone on this lake answers to me, sweetie. Ask the Hendersons how well fighting me worked out for them." The Hendersons, my elderly neighbors, had mysteriously decided to downsize after living here for 23 years. The pieces weren't clicking yet, but a cold feeling settled in my stomach. That's when she started circling my cabin, snapping pictures like a real estate appraiser of my solar panels, my vegetable garden, even my grandfather's hand-carved porch railings. The smell of her chemical air freshener coming from her idling Escalade made me want to gag. By the end of the week, I had 3 more citations, each with escalating fines. Each one made it clear that Delilah Cromwell had declared war on everything my family had built on this land. At first, I thought she was just another power-tripping neighbor. Annoying, yes, but manageable. What I didn't realize was that I had just become the target in a much bigger and more dangerous game. And petty HOA politics. Pop's words echoed in my head. Find out why they want your land. I was about to find out, and it would change everything. Delilah didn't waste any time escalating. 3 days after my compliance deadline passed, because seriously, I wasn't going to tear down Pop's stock for some wannabe dictator, certified letter arrived that turned my coffee to ash. It was a cease and desist order for violating community waterway regulations. The letterhead read Blackstone, Meyer, and Associates. One of those fancy law firms where the partners probably charge more per hour than I make in a month. The legal mumbo-jumbo claimed my dock illegally extended into the community waterway and I owed $3,000 in retroactive violation fees. They threatened to put a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 10 days. My first instinct was panic. These people had lawyers, and I had a toolbox and a bad attitude. But then I remembered something Pop always drilled into me during those long afternoons on the lake. He'd say, Marcus, when someone tries to use legal jargon to take your land, the real truth is always in the county records. Never trust what they say. Go find the original documents. So, I headed down to the county courthouse, that musty basement where all the important stuff gets buried under years of bureaucratic dust. Betty, a sweet clerk who remembered Pop from his fishing tournament days, helped me pull the original property surveys. This was a trick I learned from my union days. Always check the source documents before someone in a suit tries to confuse you with fancy letterhead. What I found made my blood boil. My grandfather's lot didn't just end at the water's edge, it extended 50 feet into the lake. The official deed from 1963 was crystal clear. That dock wasn't encroaching on community property, it was right in the middle of my lake. But the real shocker, the HOA wasn't even established until 1998, 35 years after Pop bought the land. I remembered my old foreman saying that older properties often have rights that newer developments can't touch, something about grandfathered exemptions that override any neighborhood association. Nonsense. Armed with copies of everything, I marched back to my cabin, feeling pretty damn proud of myself. That sense of satisfaction lasted exactly until I tried to leave for groceries and found Karen's Escalade blocking my driveway. Not beside it, not near it, but right across it, as if she was conducting a one-woman traffic stop. When I knocked on her window, she rolled it down just enough to speak through the gap. Oh, Marcus, I'm just reviewing the community parking regulations. This might take a while. The mechanical hum of her idling engine mixed with that overpowering air freshener created this surreal, passive-aggressive bubble of madness. Here I was, a grown man who had built half the county's electrical infrastructure, being held hostage in my own driveway by a suburban soccer mom with a power trip. But Karen was just getting started. Within a week, she had organized something called the Lakeside Beautification Committee, which sounded all nice and noble, but was really just a hit squad targeting anyone who didn't fit her country club vision. Suddenly, neighbors who'd waved at me for years were crossing the street to avoid eye contact. Her Facebook posts became masterpieces of passive-aggressive warfare. Concerned about eyesore properties ruining our home values, some people just didn't care about the community's lakefront strong property values. The comments section became a feeding frenzy. People I'd known for decades were suddenly experts on property law, parroting Karen's talking points like she was some kind of real estate prophet. 3 of my neighbors even privately apologized to me. Tom and Susan Martinez pulled me aside during my evening walk and confessed that Karen had strongly suggested they complain about my property or face their own citation blitz. Apparently, she had already targeted old Mr. Peterson for having non-regulation window boxes and threatened a young couple with a baby over their unsightly playground equipment. "She's got something on everyone," Tom whispered, glancing around like Karen might be hiding in the bushes with a camera. "Her husband works up at the state capitol, political connections, you know." That hit me like a cold slap. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This woman had connections that extended beyond our little lake community. That night, I found orange spray paint covering my mailbox, bright, aggressive strokes spelling out "comply or leave." My solar-powered security camera, hidden behind a pine tree, caught everything, including Karen's license plate as she drove away at 2:30 a.m. when I called the sheriff's office. The next morning, guess who showed up? Deputy Chad Cromwell, Karen's nephew. He took one look at the vandalism report, shrugged, and said, "Probably just kids." You know how they are. The rough texture of that spray paint under my fingers as I tried to scrub it off felt like sandpaper against my soul. Pop used to say, sometimes, you need bigger guns for a bigger fight. Time to find some bigger guns. Karen's next move came disguised as civic duty, which somehow made it even more infuriating. She figured out that direct confrontation wasn't working, so she decided to weaponize the entire county bureaucracy against me. It started with a polite knock on my door from Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a guy I'd worked with on several projects over the years. The awkward look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. Karen's next move came disguised as civic duty, which somehow made it even more infuriating. She figured out that direct confrontation wasn't working, so she decided to weaponize the entire county bureaucracy against me. It started with a polite knock on my door from Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a guy I'd worked with on several projects over the years. The awkward look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. Dale muttered as he packed up his gear, either doesn't know what they're talking about or they're just trying to waste everyone's time. The next day, Environmental Officer Jeanne Bennett showed up to investigate reports that my septic system was contaminating the lake ecosystem. Again, everything was perfectly functioning. Better than most new installations, she admitted. Then Fire Marshal Bob Rodriguez arrived to inspect my solar panels for electrical hazards. Everything checked out fine there, too. Each inspection cost me a day of peace and a hit to my retirement sanity. But, more importantly, each false report was creating a paper trail that made me look like a problem property owner. I remembered a warning from my union rep: bureaucratic harassment is a classic tactic. It looks legitimate on paper, even when it's purely malicious. While I dealt with the inspection parade, Karen was busy playing her media game. She managed to get herself interviewed on Channel 7's Community Spotlight segment, casting herself as a concerned citizen fighting to protect our family-friendly lake. The news story was a masterpiece of selective editing. She showed carefully framed photos that made my cabin look like a dilapidated shack, talked about dangerous conditions threatening children's safety, and portrayed herself as a brave advocate standing up against irresponsible property owners. What really set me off was watching her stand on my dock, the one she claimed was illegally trespassing, while delivering her concerned citizen speech for the cameras. The buzz of my phone, filled with angry texts from neighbors who had seen the story, sounded like machine gun fire. Half the lake community now thought I was some kind of environmental threat. But here's where Karen made her first real mistake: she got greedy. My old buddy Jake Martinez from the Electricians Union called after seeing the news story. "Marcus, that lady's full of it, and everyone knows it. You built half the clean energy infrastructure in this county. Hell, your solar setup is the one I use as an example when I'm training apprentices." Within 2 days, Jake had organized a parade of my former coworkers to drive by and inspect my property. Turns out, having 20 master electricians publicly vouch for your work tends to quickly shut down any talk of hazardous installations. That's when things started to get interesting. My lawyer buddy, Chuck Davis, we went to high school together, stopped by for a beer and mentioned something that caught my attention. "You know, Marcus, the Attorney General's office has been investigating HOA corruption cases statewide. Several communities are reporting similar harassment patterns to what you're describing." "What kind of patterns?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea already. "Elderly homeowners getting hit with baseless citations, property values artificially depressed, mysterious buyers swooping in with cash offers." Sound familiar? It rang every bell I had. Chuck went on to explain that these schemes usually involved someone with political ties providing cover. While harassment campaigns pushed out longtime residents, the properties would then be flipped to developers for massive profits. "The egg's office is looking for witnesses," Chuck continued. "People who've documented the harassment and can prove the pattern. Someone like you might be Exactly what they need. The hum of my refrigerator seemed unnaturally loud as that information sank in. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor, she could be part of something much bigger and more systematic. That night, I started a detailed log of every interaction, every citation, every inspection that mysteriously appeared on my calendar. I also started researching Karen's background more closely. Turns out, her husband, Robert Cromwell, wasn't just some minor state employee. He was the Democratic Party treasurer, a position that gave him access to development plans, zoning changes, and political favors across multiple counties. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the morning lake air usually calmed me, but now it only reminded me of how much I had to lose. This wasn't about HOA fees anymore. This was about whether I'd become the next victim in someone else's get-rich-quick scheme. Karen's next phase made everything before it look like a friendly disagreement. She decided that bureaucratic harassment wasn't moving fast enough, so she switched to full-scale character assassination. It started with a Facebook post that made my stomach drop. Urgent safety concerns about aggressive behavior from lakefront resident. Please keep your children away from the Eastern Shore area. We'll be filing for protective measures. Hatch Lakeside. Safety. Protect our kids. Aggressive behavior. Me, the guy who helped organize the annual Kids Fishing Derby for 15 years. Within hours, that post had been shared 43 times. The comments section turned into a digital lynch mob, with people who'd never met me, all convinced I was some kind of dangerous lunatic based on Karen's carefully crafted victim narrative. I always thought something was off about that man. Heard he threatened an HOA board member. Thank God we have brave people like Delilah looking out for us. The really disturbing part was that half of those comments came from profiles using generic stock photos, the kind of fake accounts political operatives use to amplify their message. Karen wasn't just spreading falsehoods, she was running a well-coordinated smear campaign. 2 days later, she filed for a restraining order. The petition, which became public record, portrayed me as an unstable person making threats against community leaders. It was a complete fabrication. But the filing itself was enough to paint me as dangerous. Judge Patricia Riss, who knew my family well, reviewed Karen's so-called evidence and dismissed the request due to a lack of credible documentation. However, the damage had already been done. Now, there was an official court document linking my name to the word threats. The emotional toll was beginning to weigh heavily on me. I'd sit on Pop's porch at night, sipping on a beer, questioning whether this fight was worth ruining the peaceful retirement I'd worked 30 years to build. The weight of his old leather recliner felt different now, less comforting, and more like the burden of upholding a legacy someone was methodically trying to destroy. But just as I started to consider walking away, something amazing happened. The community started to stand up for me. Judge Hendrick wasn't the only one who remembered my family. Retired Judge William Bill Carter, who used to fish with Pop back in the 70s, showed up at my door with a thermos of coffee and some unsolicited legal advice. Marcus, that woman's playing a game your grandfather would have seen right through. She's betting on you feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Don't give her the satisfaction. Bill explained that documented harassment campaigns like this often pointed to larger criminal activity. People don't go to this much effort over petty neighborhood spats. There's money involved. Big money. The local VFW Post, where I'd been a member for 20 years, released a statement calling Karen's accusations baseless attacks on a respected community member. The Historical Society also weighed in, highlighting my cabin's cultural value as one of the last original structures on the lake. Even the environmental group that monitored lake water quality praised my sustainable living practices. It felt like the entire decent part of our community was coming together in my defense. The bitter taste of stress started to give way to something that resembled hope. But Karen wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Her next move was diabolical in its simplicity. She somehow persuaded the utility company to investigate irregularities with my electrical service. For 3 days, I had no power while they examined my solar grid connection for safety violations. Then came the false police reports. Suspicious activity at my cabin during broad daylight. loud noises suggesting a potential domestic disturbance, when I was clearly alone. Possible drug activity due to the unusual number of visitors who, as it turned out, were just union friends stopping by to show support. Each call resulted in sheriff's deputies showing up at my door. Each visit added another incident report to the growing file that made me appear to be a troublemaker. The most infuriating part was that Deputy Chad Cromwell was usually the responding officer. He would show up, ask a few routine questions, and leave with a smirk that made it clear he knew exactly what his aunt was up to. During one particularly surreal visit, he actually had the nerve to say, "You know, Mr. Hanley, if you just apologized to my aunt and got your property in compliance, all these problems would probably go away." That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen was setting an example for other property owners about what happens if you don't fall in line. The Hendersons, the elderly couple who'd mysteriously chosen to sell, had probably endured the same nightmare. The constant ping of my phone became a source of anxiety rather than connection. Each notification could mean another neighbor turning against me, another false report, or another twist in Karen's psychological campaign. But it also brought messages of support from people I hadn't realized were still in my corner. The fight wasn't over, but I was finally starting to understand how the game was played. The breakthrough came when I was doing something mind-numbingly boring, organizing paperwork for my meeting with the Attorney General's office. Chuck had arranged it, explaining they needed detailed documentation for their statewide investigation into HOA corruption. I was sitting at Pop's old oak table, surrounded by piles of citations, inspection reports, and legal threats, when something caught my eye. One of Karen's violation notices had a small footer I'd never noticed before. It said, "Fines payable to Lakeside Estates Community Improvement Fund, account number 847,291. Community Improvement Fund." It sounded official, but something about it didn't sit right. Maybe it was my 30 years of reading electrical contracts and spotting the fine print that contractors use to take advantage of homeowners, but I decided to investigate further. By this point, the county clerk's office had become like a second home to me, so Betty knew exactly what I was looking for when I asked about HOA financial records. She pulled up the public filings and spread them across the counter like she was dealing cards. "Here's the thing, Marcus," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Homeowners associations have to file annual reports, just like any other organization. Let me show you what I found." The numbers didn't add up, not even close. Over the past 2 years, the HOA had collected $280,000 in emergency assessments for lake dock repairs that were never done. Another $150,000 was supposedly spent on professional landscaping services provided by Cromwell Grounds and Maintenance, a company owned by Karen's brother-in-law, according to state business records. But here's the kicker: the landscaping company was incorporated exactly 3 weeks after Karen became HOA president. I remembered Pop's advice about following the money trail. When someone starts a business right after gaining power, they're usually just setting it up to funnel money to themselves. The insurance claims were even more obvious. The HOA had submitted 3 claims for storm damage reimbursement in the past 18 months. The problem was, I had lived through every storm on this lake, and none of them had caused the kind of damage that would justify $95,000 in insurance payouts. Betty helped me cross-check the insurance claims with actual weather data from the National Weather Service. The dates didn't align. The HOA was claiming storm damage on days when the weather had been perfectly clear. "Marcus," Betty whispered, even though we were alone in the records room, "this looks like fraud. Straight-up fraud." My hands were shaking as I copied everything. The smooth texture of the documents in my hands felt like holding evidence that could change everything. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was organized theft from the entire lake community. The property management fees were the final piece of the puzzle. The HOA was paying $5,000 per month to something called Clearwater Property Solutions for administrative services. But when I checked the business registration, the listed address was a P.O. box in the same postal district where Karen lived. Everything fell into place like tumblers in a lock. Karen's harassment campaign wasn't about power or personal vendettas. She was systematically lowering property values to facilitate a development scheme, while also embezzling from the community fund. The elderly couples who had sold their cabins hadn't just been harassed into leaving, they'd been forced to sell at below market prices because Karen's manufactured concerns about property values scared away legitimate buyers. Those mysterious cash buyers were probably tied to the same development group that was benefiting from the embezzled funds. I thought about the Hendersons, probably struggling in a cramped apartment, never realizing they had been robbed twice. First, when they sold their dream home for a fraction of its worth, and second, through the fees they had paid into Karen's slush fund. The taste of black coffee had never been so bitter. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Karen had been stealing from everyone, including the neighbors she'd convinced to turn against me. Pop always said when you uncover corruption, it's usually bigger than you think. He was right. Karen wasn't just running an HOA, she was running a criminal enterprise. And I was about to give the evidence to the one person in the state who could shut it down for good. That night, I turned Pop's back bedroom into something resembling a police investigation unit. Maps of the lake property covered the walls, showing the original boundaries versus the current HOA claims. Timeline charts tracked Karen's harassment alongside suspicious financial transactions, with photos, recordings, and documents organized by potential criminal charges. I felt like one of those TV detectives, except instead of chasing serial killers, I was hunting suburban embezzlers. The Attorney General's office had assigned two prosecutors to my case, Sarah Mitchell and David Bennett, who arrived the next morning ready for business. Sarah was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, reminding me of the safety inspectors who kept us honest on job sites. David was younger, in his early 30s, but he carried a quiet intensity that suggested he had already sent plenty of white-collar criminals to prison. "Mr. Henley," Sarah said, spreading the financial documents across Pop's dining table, "what you've uncovered here goes far beyond simple HOA harassment. This is systematic fraud that could affect dozens of families." David pulled out a tablet and began making connections I hadn't even noticed. "We've been investigating similar schemes in 4 other counties," he said. "The pattern is always the same. Politically connected individuals use HOA positions to manipulate property values and embezzle community funds." That's when they told me about the FBI's involvement. Agent Rebecca Torres from the White Collar Crime Unit had been tracking development fraud across the region, apparently. My documentation was the missing link that could connect several ongoing investigations. "The beauty of financial crimes," Agent Torres explained during our video call, "is that everything leaves a paper trail. Your HOA records show classic signs of money laundering, fake invoices, shell companies, and insurance fraud. But we need more than just documents. We need witnesses and recorded evidence of ongoing criminal activity." Chuck, my lawyer, had been working behind the scenes as well. He'd gotten in touch with 17 other families from Lakefront who had faced similar harassment when we gathered them at the VFW hall. Their stories painted a picture that made my blood boil. The Thompsons had paid $8,000 in bogus violation fines before selling their cabin for 30% below market value. The Garcias had been hit with emergency assessments totaling $12,000 for lake improvements that never materialized. Old Mrs. Patterson had been so intimidated by Karen's legal threats that she moved in with her daughter in Florida, leaving behind the home she had lived in for 43 years. Every story followed the same playbook: escalating harassment, fabricated violations, pressure to sell. And every family had contributed to that so-called community improvement fund, which was really just Karen's personal slush fund. "Here's what most people don't understand about HOA fraud," explained Frank Weber, a retired accountant who volunteered to help analyze the financial records. Homeowners associations are required to file Form 1120 tax returns annually if they meet certain income thresholds. Legitimate organizations file them religiously. Corrupt ones usually don't, because honest accounting would expose their theft. Frank discovered that our HOA hadn't filed proper tax returns in over 2 years. Despite collecting hundreds of thousands in fees and assessments, that single fact could lead to federal tax evasion charges on top of everything else. The technical strategy session felt like planning a military operation. We had financial evidence, witness testimonies, recorded harassment, and documented fraud. But Agent Torres wanted something more. She wanted to catch Karen in the act of committing crimes. The best way to build an airtight case, she explained, is to create a scenario where the suspect's criminal behavior is captured by law enforcement in real time. We need her to incriminate herself on camera. That's when Chuck suggested the perfect setup. The Attorney General has been looking for an opportunity to announce new HOA reform legislation. What if she held the announcement at Marcus' cabin? It's symbolically perfect, protecting homeowners' rights in the exact place those rights were violated. Sarah's eyes lit up. And if Karen's pattern holds, she'll absolutely try to disrupt any suspicious activity at Marcus' property. Her need to control the situation will override her common sense. We spent the next week preparing for what Agent Torres called a controlled confrontation scenario. Professional recording equipment was hidden throughout my cabin, and undercover officers were positioned around the lake. Multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated for rapid response. The community coalition had grown too. Local media was alerted to potential breaking news. And social media campaigns were ready to counter any false narratives Karen might try to spin. Support networks were activated for the post-confrontation period. My old union training kicked in. When you plan a complex operation, you prepare for every possible scenario and always have backup systems. We had backup plans for our backup plans. The trap was set. Karen's behavior was so predictable that we could practically script her next move. All we had to do now was wait for her to kick down the door. Literally. Karen must have sensed the walls closing, and because her behavior shifted from calculated harassment to full-blown sabotage, it was like watching a cornered animal lash out in every direction. Growing more dangerous as her options dwindled, the first sign was when my solar panels mysteriously malfunctioned on a Tuesday morning. I woke up to dead batteries and error codes flashing on the inverter display. When my electrician buddy Jake came out to investigate, he found clear evidence of tampering. Wire connections loosened just enough to disrupt the system without causing obvious damage. "Marcus, this is professional-level sabotage," he said. Jake photographed the evidence with his phone, saying, "Whoever did this knows electrical systems. They aim to cause trouble without leaving obvious traces." But Jake was sharper than Karen had given him credit for. After the first incident, he had set up a hidden security camera near the electrical panel. 2 nights later, we caught her in the act, sneaking around my property at 3:00 a.m. with a screwdriver and wire cutters. The footage was crystal clear. Karen Cromwell, HOA president and respected community figure, vandalizing private property under the cover of darkness. The pungent odor of her cigarette smoke lingered in the morning air, mingling with the pine scent that usually brought me peace. Next was my boat dock. I had gone into town for groceries and returned to find my boat drifting halfway across the lake. The heavy-duty chains I used to secure it had been severed with bolt cutters, clean, precise cuts, leaving metal shavings scattered across the dock planks. That boat had been Pop's pride and joy, a 1978 model that still ran like a dream. Finding it stranded on the opposite shore, its hull scratched by rocks, felt like someone had desecrated his grave. But Karen's biggest mistake was targeting my septic system. I had just passed a county inspection with flying colors, but suddenly, my perfectly functioning system started backing up. The stench was unbearable, a mix of sewage and chemicals that made your eyes burn from 50 feet away. When the emergency septic service arrived, they discovered industrial-grade drain cleaner had been poured into my system, killing all the beneficial bacteria and creating a toxic mess. "This is deliberate sabotage," the technician explained, showing soil samples contaminated with chemicals. "Someone pumped commercial-grade acids into your system. This stuff is expensive and requires specialized knowledge to use." The repair bill was $3,200. But more importantly, the chemical analysis provided forensic proof that this wasn't just random vandalism, it was calculated destruction requiring insider knowledge of septic systems. While I dealt with the sewage backup, Karen was launching her media campaign. Anonymous accounts flooded social media with posts about my alleged property violations and deteriorating conditions that Great in neighborhood safety. The bots were so obvious it was almost laughable. Dozens of profiles, with generic names posting identical complaints within minutes. She also intensified her intimidation tactics. Deputy Chad Cromwell, her husband, increased his patrols dramatically, cruising by my cabin 4 or 5 times a day and always slowing down enough to make his surveillance clear. Sometimes he'd sit in my driveway for 20 minutes, running license plates of anyone who visited. The building inspector suddenly discovered code violations in work that had passed inspection just weeks earlier. The fire marshal received anonymous tips about non-existent fire hazards. Environmental Services got reports about illegal dumping on my property in areas they'd already cleared. It felt like death by 1,000 cuts, designed to drain my resources and break my spirit through bureaucratic warfare. But I wasn't the only one under attack. Karen had begun targeting my supporters too. Jake's electrical contracting license was suddenly under review for safety violations. Bill Carter, the retired judge advising me, received a formal complaint from the State Bar Association about improper legal counsel to non-clients. The VFW Post found itself facing a surprise fire safety inspection that threatened to shut down their weekly bingo nights. The Historical Society faced zoning complaints about their downtown office space. Karen was systematically targeting anyone who had shown me support, sending a clear message: "Help Marcus Henley, and you'll become our next target." The psychological pressure was overwhelming. Every morning brought a new crisis, a new emergency, a new bureaucratic nightmare to navigate. The metallic taste of stress became as familiar as my morning coffee, but Karen's desperation also created opportunities. Each act of sabotage was documented by law enforcement, providing more criminal evidence. Her supporters began to distance themselves as her behavior became more erratic. The Attorney General's office was monitoring everything, building an airtight case while Karen dug herself deeper with every vengeful act. Agent Torres referred to it as textbook criminal escalation. When perpetrators feel cornered, they often make increasingly reckless decisions that provide prosecutors with the evidence they need for conviction. Karen was walking straight into our trap, one sabotage solar panel at a time. Karen's final move was so audacious it nearly succeeded, through her husband's political connections. She had learned I wasn't just meeting with some random state official. I was meeting with Attorney General Patricia Williamson herself. Instead of backing down, Karen decided to go all in. Her plan was twisted yet brilliant. She would position herself as the victim of a political conspiracy, claiming the state's top prosecutor was targeting her family for partisan reasons. If she could record herself confronting government corruption at my cabin, she could turn the narrative around and portray herself as a brave whistleblower standing up to abuse of power. The first sign of her new strategy appeared on social media. She had contacted Government Accountability Watch, a blogger network known for amplifying stories about government overreach. Her pitch was flawless: a small-town HOA president being targeted by the government because her husband was affiliated with the opposing political party. The headline that spread 3 days before my scheduled meeting read, "Local family under attack as state officials use harassment investigation to silence political opposition." The story portrayed me as a deep state operative colluding with corrupt prosecutors to destroy an innocent family. The comments section quickly filled with outrage from people who had never heard of our lake community, yet were fully convinced that Karen was being unfairly persecuted by partisan prosecutors. She had tapped into the deep-seated, anti-governmental sentiment that exists in rural areas, positioning herself as a martyr for political persecution. But Karen's real stroke of genius was setting up a live stream. She had planned to broadcast her confrontation with the Attorney General live on social media, presenting it as citizen journalism exposing corruption in real time. Her scheme was to burst into my cabin during the meeting, record everything, and let her followers spread the footage as evidence of government misconduct. What she didn't realize was that we were already monitoring her communications. Agent Torres had secured warrants for Karen's phone and social media accounts weeks prior. We were aware of the blogger outreach, the live stream plans, and even the talking points she had prepared for her impromptu confrontation. "It's actually perfect," Agent Torres remarked during our final coordination meeting. She's going to commit several felonies on live video while providing us with a real-time confession of her motives. We couldn't have scripted it better. The irony was sweet. Karen believed she was setting a trap for us, but in reality, she was walking into one of the most thoroughly documented arrests in HOA history. Her support network was collapsing too, but she was too consumed to see it. The other HOA board members had quietly distanced themselves once the financial discrepancies became evident. Her husband was under investigation for ethics violations and could no longer offer political protection. Even Deputy Chad had been reassigned after Internal Affairs started scrutinizing his handling of vandalism reports, but Karen was too far gone to notice. The pressure of concealing her fraud while fending off multiple investigations had pushed her past the breaking point. She exhibited all the signs of losing control, paranoid about neighbors spying on her, making increasingly hostile calls to anyone who had supported me. Convinced that everyone was part of a vast conspiracy against her, the night before the Attorney General's visit, she made threatening calls to 4 different families, warning them of dire consequences if they kept cooperating with the government. Each call was recorded by law enforcement, providing additional evidence of witness intimidation and criminal conspiracy. I spent that final evening sitting on Pop's porch, watching the sunset turn the lake into shades of gold and crimson. The distant calls of loons across the water reminded me why this place was worth fighting for. Tomorrow would decide whether I could continue to enjoy peaceful evenings like this during my retirement or if I would spend my golden years fighting Karen's appeals from federal prison. The cabin felt different that night, not just because of the hidden cameras and recording equipment, but because it had become the focal point of something much larger than my personal property dispute. This was no longer just about small-time criminals with political ties terrorizing a community. It was about whether they could do so without facing any consequences. I took out Pop's worn leather Bible and read the passage he had highlighted about David facing Goliath. In the margin, he had written, "Sometimes the little guy wins because he's fighting for something greater than himself." The morning was about to bring Karen's final, desperate move. She'd stormed through that door, thinking she was about to bring down her enemies, unaware she was about to destroy herself. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling. Law enforcement was in position. All we had to do was wait for Karen to provide the grand finale to her criminal career. The anticipation, combined with the taste of my morning coffee, had never been sweeter. Attorney General Patricia Williamson was nothing like I'd imagined. Instead of an intimidating political figure, she was a down-to-earth woman in her 50s who reminded me of my high school principal. Tough but fair. With sharp eyes that missed nothing, she arrived at my cabin precisely at 9:00 a.m. carrying a thermos of coffee and a briefcase full of evidence that would change everything. "Murdoch Henley," she said, settling into Pop's old recliner like it was her own. "Your documentation has helped us build cases against whole corruption rings in 6 counties. What you've uncovered here isn't just local fraud. It's part of a statewide pattern of organized theft." We were deep into our discussion about criminal charges when we heard the unmistakable roar of Karen's Escalade speeding up my driveway, kicking up gravel as if she were in the middle of a high-speed chase. Car doors slammed, and multiple voices shouted commands about camera angles and audio levels. Karen had brought her entire social media production crew, expecting to capture her moment of victory. "Here we go," Agent Torres whispered into her earpiece from her hidden spot behind my woodshed. Attorney General Williamson didn't flinch. She continued taking notes on the financial evidence, unfazed, as Karen's voice grew louder, working herself into a frenzy for her live stream audience. "This is it, folks." Karen's voice echoed through my windows. "We're about to expose the corruption that's been targeting our family. The state's attorney general is secretly meeting with our harasser, probably planning more government persecution." The sound of her designer heels clicking rapidly across my porch was like a countdown to her downfall, not mine. Crash! The door flew inward as if she'd used a battering ram instead of her foot. Splinters of wood flew everywhere. The Attorney General's coffee mug hit the floor with a sharp ceramic crash, punctuating the moment perfectly. Karen stormed into the living room, phone held high, live streaming everything. oblivious to the fact that she had just committed criminal trespass, breaking and entering, and assault right in front of the state's chief prosecutor. "I demand to know why the Attorney General is secretly meeting with this man," she screamed, waving her phone like it was a weapon. "This is government harassment. Political persecution. I have rights." The look on her face when Attorney General Williamson calmly stood up and flashed her official ID was priceless. Karen's live stream captured the exact moment when it dawned on her what had just happened. Total frozen terror. "Mrs. Cromwell," the Attorney General said in a tone that probably made even hardened criminals shudder, "I am Patricia Williamson, Attorney General of this state. You have just committed multiple felonies in my presence, and your entire criminal performance is being recorded by both my office and your own social media broadcast." Karen's phone was still live streaming. Her followers watched in real time as their supposed whistleblower turned into a babbling, incoherent mess. The comment section exploded with confusion and disbelief as people realized they had been supporting a criminal who had just self-destructed on camera. "This is my community. I have jurisdiction here," Karen stammered, somehow still thinking her whole badge gave her authority over state prosecutors. That's when FBI agent Torres stepped through the door, flanked by 2 other federal agents. "Mrs. Cromwell, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, and criminal harassment. And thanks to your live stream, we have your confession broadcast to about 3,000 witnesses." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut resonated through my cabin like the final page of a book being turned. Karen's phone crashed to the floor, still streaming her arrest to an audience that had shifted from angry supporters to shocked onlookers witnessing a public collapse. "Karen," I said, rising from Pop's couch with a satisfied grin, "meet the state's Attorney General. She's been wanting to have a word about your bookkeeping methods." The neighbors who had gathered due to the commotion stood on my porch in stunned silence, watching as the woman who had terrorized our community for months was read her Miranda rights in my living room. Mrs. Patterson, who had driven down from her daughter's house specifically for this moment, had tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived just in time for the perp walk of Karen stumbling in handcuffs past the dock she'd tried to have demolished, the solar panels she had labeled hazardous, and the cabin she had called an eyesore. The pearl-white Escalade with its vanity plates was towed away as evidence in the fraud case. The live stream ended with Karen's voice echoing across the lake, "This isn't over. My husband will fix this. You don't know who you're dealing with." Actually, Karen, we knew exactly who we were dealing with. A criminal. And criminals go to prison. Watching Karen get sentenced 3 months later felt like Christmas morning. Federal Judge Michael Harrison didn't just throw the book at her, he threw the entire law library. 3 years in federal prison, $340,000 in restitution to defrauded homeowners, and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board in the U.S. Her husband, Robert, wasn't far behind. The ethics investigation uncovered that he had used his position as Democratic Party treasurer to leak insider information about zoning changes and development plans. He resigned in disgrace and received 18 months for conspiracy and abuse of office. The HOA itself was dissolved faster than sugar in hot coffee. In its place, we established the Clearwater Lake Volunteer Association, emphasis on volunteer. No mandatory fees, no citation authority. No power-hungry presidents, just neighbors working together to keep our little slice of paradise beautiful. My role in exposing the corruption earned me something I never expected: whistleblower compensation from the recovered fraud funds. Turns out, when you help the feds recover hundreds of thousands in stolen money, they reward you generously. That $45,000 check felt like redemption for every sleepless night Karen had caused me. But the true victory came from seeing justice ripple outward. Attorney General Williamson used our case as the foundation for new state legislation that, to my astonishment, now bears my name. The Henley Act mandates that all HOA letters undergo annual independent financial audits and creates criminal penalties for harassment-based property manipulation schemes. 3 other counties used our evidence to prosecute similar fraud rings. Karen's operation turned out to be part of a much larger network of politically connected criminals systematically robbing HOA Miners across rural areas. The FBI's final report identified over 2 dozen related cases spanning 5 states. The families that had been driven from their homes began to return. The Hendersons bought a beautiful new cabin 2 lots down from mine after their old property's fraudulent value concerns were legally dismissed. Mrs. Patterson moved back from Florida and hosted a block party that lasted until sunrise. Property values didn't just recover, they soared. It turns out that when you remove the constant threat of harassment and fraudulent citations, people actually want to live in a peaceful lakefront community. Who would have guessed? The transformation went beyond just legal victories. Our little lake became a model for sustainable living. My off-grid cabin, once Karen's target for eyesore citations, now hosts monthly tours for those interested in solar power and environmental stewardship. The state environmental agency even featured us in their renewable energy showcase program. I used part of my whistleblower compensation to create the POP's Legacy Scholarship, offering a $500 grants to students entering trade school programs. Pop always believed that hard work and working with your hands were the foundation of an honest life, so it seemed fitting to help the next generation embrace those same values. The annual Clearwater Lake Festival has grown into a regional attraction, raising money for veterans' housing assistance. Last year, we raised enough to fund 3 tiny home projects for homeless veterans. The sweet smell of barbecue and the laughter of families now fills the air, replacing the toxic atmosphere Karen once created. But the best part? The quiet moments. I'm sitting on Pop's porch right now, watching the sunset paint the lake in gold and purple hues. The loons are calling to each other across the water, their voices echoing off the hills where Pop taught me to fish 60 years ago. My solar panels hum quietly on the roof, powering a life that's finally mine again. No more certified letters, no more inspections, no more designer heels clicking across my dock at dawn, just the gentle lap of waves against weathered wood. And the comforting thought that sometimes, if you're stubborn and righteous enough, David really can beat Goliath. Last month, the Netflix documentary crew finished filming here. HOA Hell, How One Man Took Down a Criminal Empire will premiere next spring. They paid me enough to build a guest cabin where other victims of harassment can stay while they fight their own battles. Because Karen wasn't unique. There are power-hungry HOA dictators terrorizing elderly homeowners and stealing from community funds across the country. But now there's a roadmap for fighting back. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment sharing your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're not alone in this fight. These stories need to be heard. Hit subscribe if you want more tales of everyday people taking down corrupt systems. There's a lot more where this came from. Next week, I'll tell you about the city councilman who tried to shut down a veteran's food truck, only for the owner's Pentagon buddies to pay him a visit. Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, like the video, drop a comment with your reaction. And hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.